Welcome, I'm Sam Leith, the books editor of The Spectator, and it's a very great privilege to be here at Chanel number 5 and to share the stage with the great William Boyd, who after 4 and a bit decades and God knows how many books, probably needs no elaborate introduction to an audience that's paid to see him. I can say, however, which is news, that his new book, The Romantic, is absolutely superb, and well, it's very intriguing because it appears to be from reality. And Will's going to start by reading, I hope, the introduction, which will, or preface, or foreword, or author's note. Author's note, sorry, there's all that research comes in now, which will set things up.
Yes, it's. I think it's pretty self-explanatory, actually. So I'll just go. This novel starts off with an author's note. So already you readers should be feeling slightly destabilized, which is what I want. And it begins with a quote. I was born somewhere in Scotland in the early morning of 14th December 1799. Later that day, the former President of the United States of America, George Washington, died at his home in Mount Vernon, Virginia. I believe there was no connection between the two events. It is my birthday tomorrow, and I will be 82 years old. And so begins the unfinished, disordered, somewhat baffling autobiography of Cashel Greville Ross, 1799 to 1882, an autobiography plus related material that came into my possession some years ago. It consists of around 100 pages of handwritten reminiscences dated December 1881. Along with tied bundles of letters received, drafts of letters sent, some little sketches, maps and plans, some photographs, some published books filled with marginalia, and some small paintings, etchings, silhouettes, and a few objects, a tinderbox, a musket ball, a belt buckle, a tiny brittle lock of hair tied with a faded silk ribbon, a few silver dollars, a fragment of Greek amphora, and so on. This small but intriguing trove was all that had eventually amounted from the life of this individual. It was, in a real way, everything that remained of him, and was a fragmentary history of the time he had spent on this small planet. He had tried to write the story of his life, but failed. However fascinating, these scribbled pages and these few artifacts are not much upon which to construct a portrait of the man, not much for a lifespan of 80-odd years. What do we leave behind us when we die? At first it seems prodigious, all that mountain of stuff we acquire, all the possessions, the bric-a-brac and copious documentation accumulated over the average life. But inexorably and surprisingly swiftly, it begins to diminish, and after a few decades, a half-century, a century, it can amount to virtually nothing. It depends on who you are, of course, but most people don't leave much of a trace or record behind them once their goods and chattels are dispersed, once the memories of this or that individual quickly blur and fade as the younger familiars die out themselves. Diaries and letters moulder and become either bland or incomprehensible. Legal documents lurk unsought for in filing cabinets and bank vaults. Photographs of family and friends become unidentifiable, become photographs of anonymous people. And while anecdote and legend may survive a little longer, assuming that the person did anything of note or achieved any sort of fame, modest or otherwise, the fact is that for the huge majority of people in human history, their fate, after a couple of generations or 3, is to become effectively unknown, forgotten, a ghost. All that remains is a name on a headstone, a notation in a census count, an online obituary, a mention in a newspaper, and, if they're lucky, a date of birth and a date of death. So who was this Cashel Greville Ross? What was the nature of his real life? How can its unique ontology be reconstructed? At least there's some evidence to hand to begin with, but how far can it be trusted? There are many large conspicuous gaps. To attempt to embark on writing a biography of this person, a total stranger, a man born well over 200 years ago, seemed to me to be, if not entirely impossible, then an enterprise that would consist of meagre, unsatisfying supposition in the end, or perhaps, conceivably, might have, possibly, it would be half a life. Maybe that is true of biography in general. A wise man once said, all biography is fiction, but fiction that has to fit the documented facts. If this first part is correct, then perhaps it's a more interesting proposition to extend that license. The objective should be to go further than the documented facts, to go beyond the boundary of the factual palisade. And intriguingly, it is only fiction that allows us to do this. Instead of trying to write a biography of Cashel Greville Ross, I thought there was a very good case to be made that the story of his life, his real life, would, paradoxically, be much better served if it were written instead, openly, knowingly, candidly, as a novel.
Now, I don't like to cast nasturtiums on a distinguished author, but that phrase, you know, how far can it be trusted, is one that applies particularly to you, I think, in your history of hoaxes and metafictions and fakes and swerves.
Yes, I'm very, very untrustworthy, Sam. I'd be very careful.
But there's I mean, what was behind, other than the pleasure of that sort of joke, the idea of essentially creating an untrustworthy narrator who was writing a novel about a fictional character, pretending it was real?
Well, it's something I've done a lot. I've got form in that, most notably my art hoax, my Nat Tate biography, and in a way this, the romantic is Nat Tate writ large. But I do it, I think, partly to show how powerful fiction can be. I remember my very first whole life novel, The New Confessions, was published in 1987. I'm vaguely appalled to relate. And it purported to be the autobiography of a Scottish filmmaker called John James Todd, and, born at the end of the 19th century, and his life follows the history of cinema to a large extent. And it was reviewed by in the Times by the then very eminent critic Bernard Levin, who some of you may remember. And I suppose, you know, Bernard Levin was a kind of public intellectual who occasionally deigned to review fiction. And he reviewed the New Confessions very favourably. And he said, and I paraphrase, said something like, "So hypnotised was I by the autobiographical form, I found myself riffling through the pages looking for the photographs." And I thought, photographs, I've missed a trick there. And, but it sort of set me off on this, there was no plan, but I now look back and I can see that time and again, I'm trying to write fiction that seems so real that the reader begins to forget it's fiction, you know, just almost subliminally or unconsciously. And so I'm like, you know, a cannibal eating the brains of his enemy to make him stronger, in that I push fiction into the world of the real, and documentary and history and reportage, just to show that what I firmly believe, that the best way of explaining ourselves to each other, the best way of explaining the human condition, the human predicament, is in a novel. Because only in a novel do you get free and guaranteed access to other people's minds. People are opaque, mysterious. You never really know what they're thinking, but you do in a novel. You know what Elizabeth Bennet's thinking about Mr. Darcy because Jane Austen tells you, and it's true. So paradoxically, and so that's what I've been doing, I think, with my whole life novels in particular, and books like the Nat Tate hoax and so on. Just writing fiction that makes you think, God, this could be real, and therefore the fiction becomes all the more powerful.
Yeah. Why the whole life novel? Because I mean, obviously, one of the things that fiction most often does is select. You know, a story has a shape, and lives typically don't, and they're typically governed by randomness. And which of course is impossible in books. Yeah. What is it that, you know, is there a sort of art in making something look artless?
Yes, I mean, it's technically quite difficult, actually, because if you're going to write a true whole life novel, you'd write a 5,000-pager. So there's a lot of elision and a lot of flash forward and flash back, which is required. But I think it was, it was the response to The New Confessions, which, you know, starts with the birth of this character and ends with near his death. And people reacted to it in a way that seemed slightly different from an orthodox novel. Because as the reader, you have all the information, boring and interesting, and highs and lows. Whereas in in an orthodox novel, even the great Victorian novels, they're not whole life novels. Nicholas Nickleby ends long before Nicholas Nickleby dies, and so you don't know what happens in the rest of his life. When you read a whole life novel, it's almost as if you're reading about, or you end up having read about somebody you know. You know the disasters and the successes and the blunders and the equivocations, the ups and downs, the doubts, and so on. And so there's a real connection between reader and character, which I don't think is replicated in an orthodox novel. I've written orthodox novels, of course, but now I've written, this is my fourth whole life novel. If you count Nat Tate, it's only 80 pages long, but it's my fifth in that sense. But the same effect occurs, that the whole life of the character gives the reader a different sense of that character than an ordinary novel.
And when you're threading your character, I mean, you've given Cashel, he goes to Waterloo, he's in Italy with the Romantics, he's all over the shop. He's got lots of points he touches on, or near, in 19th century or late 18th, early 19th century history. Do you see it as a way of kind of looking at historical events in the shape of the century, or is the shape of the century simply another way into the character?
Yes, I'm more interested in the character, but of course I take the character to places and events and encounters with people that intrigue me. And it seems picaresque, but actually it's very manipulated by me. But it's not so much trying to throw a new light on history. It's using historical events again to give this sense of reality. So, and I'm sort of ticking romantic tropes along the way. The Battle of Waterloo appears in Stendhal's Charterhouse of Parma, famously, and so I thought, well, I'll do my Battle of Waterloo as well. And Cashel goes off to America to found some idealistic kind of hippie community, which he calls Libertania, and so that's a nod to Thoreau and Walden Pond and the American Romantic movement. But it's really putting him in situations where you learn more about his character and his nature and his development. So by the time you get to the end of the novel, and he's an old man, you have this incredible familiarity with him, almost like a member of your family, I think.
Yeah. You are, at least by reputation, an architect rather than a gardener as far as novelists go. You plan, you have a structure, you work to it, rather than doing that. My characters tell me where to go. How does that sort of affect the way you write a book like this? Do you just sort of think, as you say, picaresque, string these episodes to string it through history, or is there a sort of sense in which you do allow yourself to be surprised?
No, I'm quite, I'm not a prisoner of my method, but I do like to plan the book in great detail before I start writing, and I also like to know exactly how it's going to end, so I have my destination. And even to the extent I've sometimes written the last paragraph of my novel before I've started on page 1, because I know exactly the kind of tone I want to strike, or the catharsis I want to provoke. And so it allows me to write with confidence. It's just my modus operandi. It's not for everybody. Some novelists just start writing and hope the muse descends each day. But what if she doesn't descend? That's when novels get abandoned. And I think my kind of, my Calvinistic Scottish background makes you can't abandon a novel, laddie. And I'd like to plan it all in detail, but I often make huge changes. And I believe, that question, do characters take you over? I always quote Vladimir Nabokov, one of my favorite writers, who was asked this very question: you do find your characters are leading you in directions you never expected? And he said, no. All my characters are galley slaves, and I'm the man on the deck with a whip. And so I sort of feel I'm a bit of I'm wielding a whip, and so they are my creatures and they do my bidding. But of course, it's a life, and life is random and haphazard. It's good luck and bad luck. So there's a lot of, as you say, a lot of artifice to make it seem artless and seem that you're following the pattern you know, the life that we all have. We think we know what's going to happen tomorrow, but we can't be sure.
Do you, I mean, we're in an audience and assembled company that contains a number of, you know, quite serious historians. As somebody who writes novels that will play with history, do you feel a kind of duty to history? Do you think, I've got to get this much right and I'm filling in the interstices, or do you feel you could move the Battle of Waterloo to Tuesday?
No, I do my research because I'm aware that if you enter into an area of knowledge where there are experts, you know, you better be on your mettle. So I did a tremendous amount of reading around the Battle of Waterloo, and I think Cashel's experience on the battlefield is absolutely accurate. Similarly, when, because there's another one of my tricks that I introduce my fictional character to real historical people. So when Cashel joins the circle around Shelley and Byron in Pisa in 1822, I read a great deal of Byron, but I know a lot about Shelley because I spent 8 years not completing a PhD thesis on his poetry. Is there
an element of revenge in here? Because
yes, it's a real demythologizing project going on, because when you think of Shelley in the popular mind, he's probably the most mythic poetic figure, because there was no likeness of him done during his life, oddly. There's no picture, no drawing, no painting, and so we have these posthumous images of this, you know, this sort of fey, blonde-haired person with his shirt unbuttoned to his navel, gazing dreamingly into the middle distance. But when I started my thesis, one of the first books I read was Byron's mistress, Teresa Guiccioli's memoirs of Shelley, and, you know, scales fell from my eyes. She said he was very tall, he had sort of reddish hair, he had extremely bad skin, she said. So he obviously had terrible acne as an adolescent. And she also said he had the most uneven teeth I've ever seen in a young man. so I suddenly thought, no, he's not this sort of fey creature. He's a tall, gangling, acne-ravaged old Etonian. And suddenly Shelley came alive for me. And similarly, Byron, he was you know, very overweight in 1822, so I think it's quite interesting, and a terrible snob. You know, Stendhal met Byron in Venice and absolutely detested him because all he talked about was social rank all the time. So these details seem to me to be worth bringing to the public's attention, you know, just to kind of correct the balance slightly. But I do take enormous care to get, you know, facts right, like, you know, from. In the 19th century, Cashel's life, 1799 to 1882, was a period of enormous technological change. Not just, you know, chamber pots to flushing toilets, but also coach and horses to express trains, letters to telegraph, and so on. And very like, in a way, the trajectory of our own lives from analog to digital, you know, massive change. And similarly, someone who led that life in the 19th century would have been stunned at what had happened to them. And at the very end of the book, I'm not giving anything away, Cashel is in Baden-Baden in a rather grand hotel, and he's taken into a box which carries him up to the 5th floor, a lift, my God. The bellboy switches on electric light and then shows him how to operate a flushing toilet. So he's very pleased to have lived long enough to have these conveniences. But it's actually it's worth thinking about what happened from the beginning of the 19th century towards its end. It was a massive change in everybody's life, certainly in the West. You know, it's a huge, huge upheaval.
Now, you talk also, you know, about the models for the book and the idea, you know, you called it the romantic, and, you know, you're steeped in romantic literature. I'm wondering, before you became a novelist, you did work as an academic, as a Don, for some years. Are you one of those writers who finds having the practice of criticism helpful to the move to fiction, or is it something that needs to be kind of put on the back burner?
Yes, I think it's definitely the latter. I mean, I'm a critic as well. I still write reviews for you, Sam. So
It's normally our rivals in the New Statesman, normally, but we can change that.
No, I think you have to be a bit ignorant to be a novelist, actually, and you have to you have to feel free to make a fool of yourself in a way. And if you're conscious of the great tradition, if you're conscious of critics waiting to analyze your work, you won't take those risks. And so I park what remains of my academic self a long way away from my novelist's persona, and I write on as if I was unaware of them, because I do think it, and I know writers for whom this applies, I do think it impedes you if you're constantly second guessing what the critical response is, or where you fit in the canon of 20th, 21st century literature. You have to be, yes, as I say, you have to be free to make a fool of yourself and take risks, because that will make your fiction live or die, but at least it has a kind of animating spirit.
As you say, you don't sit and worry about where you fit. Do you feel any sort of groupness or kinship with any of your contemporaries or other writers? I mean, I'm thinking back to the early 1980s. There's the Granta Best of Young British Novelists list, and there's a mane-haired young tyro, as you were. And
yes, what happened to that mane?
Do you know? Yes, did you? I mean, would you at the time you were kind of your first couple of novels had come out, I think, and you were viewed as a kind of comic novelist primarily.
Yes.
Does 1983 you look forward, and would you be surprised by 2022
I don't think so, and in a way that sort of group, or that grouping which was a marketing campaign, it made it seem as if there was some sort of gang of novelists, young novelists taking over the world, and I know a lot of those people and still know them, and we're friends and acquaintances. But I actually think it's quite hard to group novelists together. In a way, it's easier to group poets or painters, but we're sort of solitary beasts. And I've often said that a room full of novelists is one of the most uncomfortable social gatherings you can imagine. We're all looking over our shoulders and being polite, but we're not gregarious. And so I think that it's a kind of false grouping. And I had written a comic novel, Good Man in Africa. I'd written a book of short stories, and then I'd written another sort of epic about the First World War in East Africa, which had its comic absurd notes. But I was always conscious every novel was going to be slightly different, and that's how it's panned out. And so I don't see any affinity with my contemporaries particularly, but there are writers, of course, who I admire and like, and can see I'm sort of doing the same thing. But it's almost wisdom of hindsight rather than anything. I must align myself with the work of J.G. Farrell, or something like that. So it's just I recognise tone of voice. But a lot of the writers I love and reread are very unlike me and unlike the novels I write.
Yeah. You did do a Bond novel at one point as well, which I think surprised people. Did?
Yes, it was. I'd written a spy novel called Restless, and in my novel Any Human Heart, Ian Fleming is actually a character in it. Gives the fictional character a job in the naval intelligence, playing around with fact and fiction again, blurring the boundary. And I suspect that, I think, because I've written about Fleming quite a lot, because I find him a fascinating case study of a certain type of self-loathing Englishman, Scotsman. And I think maybe that's why the Fleming family asked me to write one of these continuation novels. I said yes instantly, because you get total liberty. You're just given the gift of this character, and you have to respect some of the conventions of a Bond novel. There have to be cars in it, but it was a job, But it was a really great job, and I took it very seriously, and reread all of the Fleming Bond novels in chronological order, taking notes. And everything in my Bond novel that seems odd is actually sourced in Fleming. For example, Bond was a very nervous flyer, which you don't expect, but because you're thinking of the movie Bond. When Bond saw some particularly graphic violence or a gory scene, he would often vomit. He was also a functioning alcoholic, which is quite interesting. And I was almost like a fretful wife. I was counting the drinks he had. And there's a great line in one of the novels, I think it might be Live and Let Die, where it starts, Bond knew that the 13th double whiskey had been a mistake. 13, that's a bottle and a half, you know. And there's another epic flight from Russia with Love when he leaves London Airport, as it then was, to fly to Istanbul. And because of the time and the distance, you stopped at various places to refuel the plane. So they stop in Rome, and Bond has a couple of Americanos at the bar, and then they fly to Athens, and he has a couple of ouzos at the bar, and then on the final leg of the journey he has 2 dry martinis and half a bottle of red wine. So he must have fallen off the plane as he landed and went to fight his foes. So I put all this stuff in the Bond novel and had great fun with it, actually, and it's an interesting Bond novel as well, I think, because unlike all the Fleming novels, I completely restrict the point of view to Bond. So as a portrait of this, mythic character, I think it's quite detailed, and you enter his mind and you know what he's thinking. My novel set in 1969, when he would have been 45, and Double O's had to retire at 45. So maybe it was his last mission in my novel, but it was a very interesting job of work, and I'm very happy to have it sitting alongside all my other novels, but I won't do it again.
Yes, once is enough.
Yes.
Now, Cashel himself is a writer. Publishing is not kind to Cashel, at least initially. I'm wondering whether there's a sort of subterranean joke about the modern publishing industry. Do you think publishing is easier these days than it was in the 19th century?
No, I mean, Cashel, let's spoiler alert. Cashel,
oh, sorry.
Cashel gets seriously ripped off by his publisher. He's had a huge success with an anonymous novel, and the publisher has stolen all his money and run away. This happened to me. And so I had this enormous success with my second novel, An Ice Cream War, in France. I sold 200,000 copies, and I was in my early 30s. I won the lottery. It was amazing, and I knew exactly how much money I was going to be paid in 2 years' time. And in fact, my wife Susan and I had already spent a lot of that money before it arrived. Anyway, so it didn't arrive, and I rang my agent. I said, where's the French money, for God's sake? And it was about, it's a lot of money today, but it was about £85,000 I was owed by my French publisher, because he'd had this huge best-selling success with An Ice Cream War. My agent, I remember, never forget, she rang back and she said, bad news, Will. He's gone bust. And he'd been using my royalties to pay off various creditors, and I liked this guy. His name was André Ballon, and I'd had lunch with him many times, and I said, André, what the bloody hell is going on here? And he said, you'd better sue me, because that's the only way you have a chance of getting any of your money back. Oh, I'm a 33-year-old impoverished novelist in London. How am I going to sue an established French publisher in Paris? But I had a wonderful translator in France who was a very formidable woman. She said, I'll find you a lawyer, and she did. And so I sued my French publisher for the return of my royalties that he owed me. It was pure theft, and the lawyer said, we will win, but it'll take a long time. And then I discovered that he'd sold part of his company to a French taxi firm. And they, in their turn, had ripped me off all my paperback rights and my book club rights. So I actually was owed about 120 grand by these charlatans. And I sued them, won the case, they appealed, I sued again, won the case, they appealed. And we went up through the French legal system to the very summit, which is called the Cour de Cassation, where they look to see if you put the full stop in the right place or something like that. And I won, and I got back about half of the money I was owed. But the good thing, the silver lining, was I was able to take my 3 novels away from Monsieur Ballon and resell them to a very eminent French publisher, Le Seuil, and that's who I'm still with to this day. So Cashel's travails with Victorian publishers, you know, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. You know, it happened to me in the 1980s.
I thought there was a special vividness to that section.
Well, actually, again, slight spoiler, Cashel gets his brother to track down this errant publisher, and the brother, who's a bit of a thug, breaks both his legs. So there you are, a little bit of vicarious revenge. You know.
No spoilers. But, right. I think it's time that I stopped monopolising our eminent author and asked anybody in the audience if you have any questions for Will. If you're a French publisher, please slide quietly out the back. Do absolutely, but wait for the roving mic. Sorry, there's somebody there and somebody just there. I don't know. Have we got a roving mic? Maybe we have. Yes, there we go. Well, whoever gets the roving mic first, you start. Sorry, I can't see a damn thing.
Yes, feel free to ask me anything about the writing life, because I've done virtually every job you can do as a writer, from restaurant criticism to poetry to Hollywood movies. So if you're curious about any of these aspects of the writing life, I'll do my level best to reply candidly.
Right, just testing. Yeah, you can hear, good. What I'd like to ask is, when you finished a novel, and for example, The Romantic, obviously a great deal of your energy has gone into the writing. So do you feel a sense of loss afterwards, akin to grief? And secondly, how long is it before you feel you're ready to embark on your next piece of work?
Well, there is a sort of release when you finish a novel, but you know it's not finished because it's going to go into your agent, to your editor, and there'll be questions and changes, and the process continues. I suppose it's only when you have the book in your hand that you finally realise that that's it, it's done. And then you have to go and promote it. So there's never really a sense of closure, I find. And I will be talking about this book next year to my foreign the audience is my foreign publisher, and so it lives on with you. I have a sort of ingrained work ethic, and so I finish a novel, hand it in, have a couple of days off, and then usually start writing a film or television. I have this parallel life as a screenplay writer. I've written a lot of films and a lot of television shows. Over 20 have been made. So I have this, I moonlight in that world. And so while I'm thinking of my next novel, I'm writing away on screenplays, and I still write a lot of journalism. I've written plays as well, so I'm always writing something, and I think that's part of British literary culture. I mean, you agree, Sam, that it's sort of normal for us to write a lot. I mean, other literary cultures I know, American and French, well, it doesn't seem the same. I mean, Donna Tartt, for example, she's not new, she's practically my age. She's only written 3 novels, for heaven's sake. And it's the same in French culture. There's not this sense that an oeuvre can be 3 or 4 novels. Whereas I think in our culture it seems entirely normal to write what seems like a lot, but you're just writing every day. And so I am very much like that. And so when there's no sense of which I can say, it's done, it's finished, what will I do now? Because I'm already doing something now.
Is it every single day?
pretty much, I mean, I'm also a journal keeper. I've kept a diary since I was 19 or 20 years old. And so this is a document of many million words now. So even if I'm not writing a novel or a screenplay, I might jot down a few thoughts in my diary. And it's a working diary. It's not, it will never be published, but it's an aide-memoire because memory is the most flighty and unreliable of human capabilities. And you forget what you've done and you forget what you've thought. But I can go right back to my 19-year-old self and see what a dickhead I was. So it's amazing how transformative memory is, but I have the evidence of everything that I've done. But as I say, it's mainly to do with my work rather than great thoughts, But so I'm always writing, and it's rare that there isn't a day where I'm writing something.
Anybody else? Just there.
A couple of questions, if I might. Where do you write best? I seem to remember, something like when you were doing your early novels, you wrote, I think, in Rhodes House in Oxford. I may be wrong on that, but where do you find you get your best inspiration for writing?
Well, it's true. When I was at Oxford, I was what's called a college lecturer, sort of very junior don, and I was failing to write my thesis and teaching, and I was actually writing a television column for the New Statesman as well in the early 80s. And I used to write my novels in Oxford's libraries, in the Bodleian and in Rhodes House, which is a kind of, well, it was then a kind of forgotten library, but I didn't need to be alone, funnily enough, and people would walk to and fro, you hear conversations. I was somehow able to just switch off any distractions and write. And as I became slightly more prosperous and had my own study, I found I could write there just as well. But if the phone rings, I'll answer it. I don't have that kind of Proustian need for a cork-lined room and no interruptions. I can sort of switch my brain off and switch it on again. And I suspect that's because I started out writing novels in libraries. And so I work at home, I've got a decent room with loads of books in it, but I could write in a cafe, I suppose, if I needed to. So I'm not fussy. I try not to have too many fetishes, as a novelist, because they're often just an excuse for not working. Muriel Spark, who's one of my favourite novelists, could only write her novels in a certain jotter, as they're called in Scotland, which she bought from Finn's, the bookseller on the North Bridge. And then all their stock of notebooks was burned in a fire. And she thought she'd never be able to write another novel again. So you don't want to get in that situation. I do have a few fetishes. I've got the perfect pen. And I like ring-backed notebooks. So I write in longhand, write the first draft in longhand. But otherwise, I don't need so many circumstances to be right around me in order to get on with the day's work.
Any genres that you want to attack next?
Well, I've fairly recently started writing plays, and I've had 3 plays produced, but it's such a difficult world to enter, and I think it's a small pond, and some theatre director said to me, you do realise that at any one time there are 2,000 plays out there looking for a theatre. And I'm not going to be frustrated. So that's the next kind of mini Alp I want to climb, to write another play and have it put on. But it's really difficult, I've discovered. And you're not welcome, by the theatrical community. You're seen as an interloper, why don't you go away and write another novel? So I've written another play, and I'm taking steps to see if I can get it put on anywhere. In a pub, that'll do. But I don't have any. I'm writing films and writing television drama, and that keeps me busy most of the time when I'm not writing novels.
Sorry, ladies first.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
I was going to ask, I sense a strong connection, formed connection with Scotland, and I wondered, many of the characters you draw in that background, and I just wondered, do you still feel romantically about Scotland? I know you don't live there, but is it still with you while you're writing?
Yes, I think so. I think if I was asked what's your nationality, I would say I'm Scottish, because both my parents are Scottish and they were born in Fife, 9 miles apart from each other, as it happened. But I'm a curious example of the Scottish diaspora, I think, and I often describe myself as Afro-Scots because I was born and raised in West Africa, in first of all in Ghana and then Nigeria. And for the first 20 years of my life, I've regarded it as my home. I was more at home in Western Nigeria than I was in Western Scotland. But of course, like a lot of exiled Scots, you're sort of somehow more Scottish than if you lived in Scotland. And you know, my father would play Kenneth McKellar songs on the hi-fi to kind of waft him back to Fife. So I grew up with that kind of background. And of course, when my parents went on leave from Africa, we'd go back to the family in Scotland. So it's very much stitched into my being. But it's odd because I think if you're a sort of exiled Scot or part of the Scottish diaspora, as I am, you're often not welcome in Scotland, I've discovered. Because sometimes I look at anthologies of Scottish contemporary literature and I'm not in it, pointedly, and sometimes I am in them. You know, so I think there's it's nothing to do with me. It's to do with there's this division in Scotland called Red Scots and Black Scots. I don't know if you're familiar with it. A Scottish historian came up with it, and the Black Scots are the ones who leave, and the Red Scots are the ones who stay and tend the kale yard. And there's a certain animus between the two groups, and it has always been there. And maybe it's true of all small countries, in fact, because it is a small country, and people tend to leave it. Maybe it's true of Iceland, you know, for example. But there's this slight tension between the Scots who've stayed and the Scots who've left, you know. And I've sort of sensed it a bit, but it hasn't affected my own feelings about, you know, my roots.
Does it bug you if you're not in those anthologies?
Not in the slightest. No, not in the slightest. It's just I note it, you know, that's all. But it's you know. So I remember William Styron, the American novelist, saying he's sick to death of being called a Southern writer. He said, I'm a writer who happens to live in the southern states of America. And I sort of feel that's rather my, you know, I'm a writer who happens to be Scottish by birth and parentage. So it's not the defining adjective about me.
William, I love The Romantic. I think it's superb. Congratulations on that. But and I know it's extremely annoying for a novelist to be asked if any of the characters or events in their novels are based on themselves. But since you've opened that Pandora's box unwisely with your publisher's going bankrupt story, I have to ask, having loved all the picaresque adventures and love affairs of Cashel, if there are any other shadows of your own life or experiences in this wild life that you can admit to?
I don't think so, actually. I mean, a lot of you as a novelist goes into a novel anyway, in sort of opinions and reactions, and the sort of value system is apparent, you know. But I think there's nothing particularly autobiographical in that. I mean, there's a whole episode in Central Africa when Cashel becomes an explorer, and that sort of is a nod to my African upbringing, but it's also because I wrote a mini-series about Burton and Speke and Livingston and Stanley, and it never got made. And so I thought, nothing is wasted, you know. So I thought, well, I'll just send Cashel off. And again, like a bit like Byron and Shelley, had this huge store of knowledge and very strong opinions about that particular period. And so that's the link, you know. But otherwise, I think it's more to do with the kind of writer you are. I'm you know, it's almost defiantly non-autobiographical. And I think writers are divided, novelists can be divided into those who use their own lives as raw material and those who don't. And of course, there's often a certain crossover, but I am in that latter category. I like to make things up. I like to use my imagination. I've often written novels set in places I've never been. I wrote a novel called The Blue Afternoon, which is set in the Philippines in 1902. I've yet to set foot in the Philippines, and it's quite a funny story. That I wrote this novel, and I got a letter from the advertising company J. Walter Thompson, Manila office. And they said, "Dear Mr. Boyd, I thought you'd like to know we love your novel in J. Walter Thompson, Manila. And every time we have a new client, we give them a copy of The Blue Afternoon just to tell them something about the history of our beautiful country. When did you live in Manila and where?" So, you know, no higher compliment. So that just shows you I can fake it with the best of them, you know. So it's, but it's part of the kind of novelist I am. You know, I like to invent characters and invent situations, though I will often, you know, use, you know, a lot of the places Cashel goes to. I haven't been to India or Sri Lanka though. But I have been to Paris, and I've actually been to Shelley's villa on the Gulf of La Spezia when I was doing my research. But that's the only connection. It's nothing to do with my life particularly.
I think, unfortunately, we are... Oh, no, we've got 5 more minutes. So one more question. I'm conscious of not holding up the next event. One more question. Who's burning to ask it? Gentleman there. Lady there.
It's really about the editing process once you finished a book.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
It's about the editing process once you finish a book, which I don't know much about. But do you ever row over certain words or sentences? And when was the last time you lost or won? Maybe you always win, but do you ever have arguments over certain things that have to stay?
No, I think it's a good question. I think I'm one of those authors or one of those novelists who, you know, I don't hand in a novel until I'm absolutely happy with it myself. And I think because of my academic background, if you like, I sort of edit it myself. I have a very trustworthy first reader, my wife Susan, who's a remarkably honest person. So her reaction to the book is incredibly important, and I listen to what she has to say. So when I hand the book in, I'm sort of saying, here it is, I'm happy with it, but all intelligent suggestions gratefully received. And then I weigh them up. And of course, agents and editors are smart people, and sometimes they'll make a point about, you know, I think the end of chapter 14 is a bit weak or something like that. And you know, if it's acute and valid, then I will make adjustments. But I think I'm a very under-edited novelist. You know, famously, Thomas Wolfe, the American author, used to hand in a sort of vast manuscript to Maxwell Perkins, his editor at Scribner's, and say, "I think there's a novel in there somewhere. Can we find it?" You know, and I'm not that sort of a novelist, but I do, you know, and I have second thoughts and third thoughts myself. And in the various stages that you go through before the finished book arrives, you have, you know, possibilities for change and possibilities to tweak things. So, you know, I'm open to suggestions, but I'm, you know, maybe a little bit, it's not arrogant, it's just a conviction that I have written the novel I wanted to write. And it's very rarely that I make any changes.
Well, the novel that he wanted to write, in its latest incarnation, is here. And it's a novel that you should all want to read. So Will is going to be signing books, I think. So I strongly recommend that you buy at least 2 copies of this book, one to keep and one to give away. You won't regret it. And now please join me in thanking William Boyd.